Good evening. My name is Susan Flannery, and I'm the director of the Cambridge Public Library. On behalf of the Library Board of Trustees, I want to welcome you to this evening's reading, another in our continuing series which is co-sponsored by the Harvard Bookstore in Harvard Square. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Jim and his staff from the City Cable Office for taping tonight's program so that we can make it available to a larger audience. And tonight, for the first time, C-SPAN is here, and they'll make this program available to a much wider audience. Upcoming programs that might be of interest to you. Tomorrow evening, Christine Palmadesi Moore and Carol Bonomo Albright will be reading from their works on the Italian-American experience. On Thursday evening, Jill McCorkle will be here to read from her new novel, Carolina Moon. Next Wednesday, on October 23rd, we'll be having a symposium on the public library in the 21st century, an exploration of possibilities. On October 24th, Tina McElroy Anso will be here. And on October 28th, Dr. Jocelyn Elders will be here to speak about her autobiography. On November 8th, Andre Brink will be here to speak about his new novel. And on November 12th, Villani Davis will be here. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, just turn in your name and address at the front desk on your way out tonight, and we'll keep you up to date on new programs. Paul Fussell grew up in pastoral Pasadena, California, the son of a prominent attorney. His education at Pomona College did not prepare him for the tragic horror of the trenches in World War II. His valor in that conflict earned him a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. After the war, he completed a master's degree and a PhD at Harvard University. He accepted a teaching position at Connecticut College for Women, where Kirkus Review says he waged war on the sensibilities of the young girl children, whom he routinely reduced to tears. He climbed the academic ladder and published as expected. He told Robert Dahlen of Publishers Weekly that it wasn't until he got tired of writing what he was supposed to write that he became a successful author. His breakthrough book, The Great War in Modern Memory, sold 50,000 copies and was awarded the National Book Award and the National Critics Circle Award. After abroad, British literary traveling between the wars, Mr. Fussell returned to the issue of war in the Boy Scout Handbook and Other Observations, and Thank God for the Atom Bomb, and Wartime, Understanding and Behavior in the Second World War. He told John Blaze of the Chicago Tribune in 1991, "I finished what I like to think is my last book on the subject of war." Fortunately for us, that was not the case. I'm very pleased to introduce Paul Fussell.
Thank you so much. I'm just getting some water out here. Good evening. I'm glad to see so many people here. That's a real comfort in these days of electronic transmission. It's nice to know that somebody's interested in books still. As you've heard already, I grew up in an extremely erotically peaceful environment. I never heard of anything like violence. I grew up in Pasadena, California, amongst the upper middle classes. Everybody was sweet. The city was clean. There was virtually no crime, violence, and I went to a local peaceful college, whence I joined the Army in 1943. Soon I was a soldier, and a little later I was an infantry officer. Now, if you know the history of being an infantry officer from literature or from films or from even a rumor, you know that one of the worst things you can be is a young infantry officer. Most of them in combat last about 4 weeks, and then they are wounded or killed. It is a very difficult and awful thing. I was only 20 years old, and I was full of optimism and self-belief, and I really thought I could manage beautifully. I'm going to read some passages from this new book called Doing Battle, The Making of a Skeptic, which, by the way, is a total autobiography. Many people think it's a war memoir, but only part of it is. It's an autobiography about beginning with my childhood in California and then coming up to the present moment. And it's really about how my subsequent life as an author and a critic and even a scholar has been influenced by my boyhood in the Second World War. I know a lot of people here know the name of Wyndham Lewis, the great, now almost forgotten, alas, British, actually Canadian, author and painter and artist and art theorist. He had, before the First World War, very much the experience that I had before the Second World War. It was an experience of absolute belief in life as a benign theater of fine motives. And he wrote this in 1914. He wrote, "Life was good and easy, and I called life friend. I'd never hidden anything from him, and he'd never hidden anything from me, or so I thought. I knew everything. He was an awfully intelligent companion. We had the same tastes, apparently, and he was awfully fond of me. And all the time, he was plotting up a mass murder." The similarity of that reaction to my reactions throughout is one of the things that's always struck me and has attracted me towards trying to understand the plight of the young infantry officers of the First World War, which I've written about. I'm going to start by reading a little of a passage which indicates my first understanding of what I was really implicated in when I arrived on the line, as we called it, in France, southern France, in 1944, November of 1944. The date here is wonderful. I arrived on the line on 11th. Can you imagine the irony? If you were writing a novel, you'd have to put that in, but it was true. We did a night relief, my rifle company consisting of 200 people. I was leading a rifle platoon of 40 men, or better, children. They were adolescents, most of them. And we relieved another unit at night so that we didn't see anything until the light came up again in the morning. At dawn, I awoke, and what I now saw all around me were numerous objects I had miraculously not tripped over in the dark. These were dozens of dead German boys in greenish-gray uniforms, killed a day or two before by the company that we were replacing. If darkness had mercifully hidden them from us, dawn disclosed them with staring open eyes and greenish white faces and hands like marble, still clutching their rifles and machine pistols in their 17-year-old hands. One body was only a foot or so away from me, and I found myself fascinated by the stubble of his beard, which would have earned him a rebuke on a parade ground, but not here, not anymore. Michelangelo could have made something beautiful out of these forms in the tradition of the dying Gaul, and I was astonished to find that in a way I couldn't understand. At first they struck me as awful, but curiously beautiful. But after a moment I had no feeling but horror. My boyish illusions, largely intact to that moment of awakening, fell away all at once, and suddenly I knew that I was not and would never be in a world that was reasonable or just. To transform silly conscripts into cold marble after passing them through unbearable humiliation and fear seemed to do them an interesting injustice. Until that moment in the woods, the only dead people I'd seen had been my mother's parents, placid, dignified, cosmeticized, and decently on display in their expensive caskets. Unlike these ill-treated youth, they had been gathered full of years, cooperative participants in the inexorable process by which the universe deals with its superannuated organisms. These boys were different. They had been not fulfilled, but cheated. But worse was to come almost immediately. The captain called for me, and as I ran toward him down a forest path, I met a sight even more devastating. The dead I'd seen were boys. Now I saw dead children, rigged out as soldiers. On the path lay two youngsters, not older than 14, probably closer to 12, actually. Each had taken a bullet in the head, the brains of one extruded from a 1-inch hole in his forehead, pushing aside his woolen visor cap so like a schoolboy's. The brains of the other were coming out of his nostrils. At this sight, I couldn't do what I wanted, go off by myself and cry. I had to pretend to be very tough because I was setting the style of my platoon, and if we all cried, we would have lost the war. I had to pretend to be, if not actually gratified, at least undisturbed by this spectacle of our side victorious. And it was clear that what I saw in front of me was exactly what we had been sent to Europe to do. That is to kill German soldiers, regardless of their age, and thus forward the end of the war. We had been trained to do that, and we took pride frequently in doing it well. It took me a little while to get used to it. But once you get used to it, you have no scruples whatever about killing people. And that's one of the problems of being in the cutting edge of the Army. Now, I don't want to suggest that I'm going to talk entirely about German corpses, but there's another little vignette on that topic that I want to give you. It is now about 5 months later, and it is in January, February of 1945, terribly cold winter, one of the coldest winters in Europe for a long time. The Battle of the Bulge has just concluded north of us on the line, and we are now dealing with what was called Operation Nordwind, North Wind, which was an attack mounted by the Germans on the province of Alsace, hoping to break through there. We were in defense there, and now let my text take it up. Probably because I was growing, no, let me say, this is something most people don't know, that in the Army, in combat, or the Marine Corps, if you are snotty and difficult and unfriendly, you are very likely to be loaded with the most dangerous experiences. Largely small attacks or patrols and so on. The object is to get rid of you. And since you're living in a world of death anyhow, it doesn't really matter who gets killed much. The point is to make the job as effective as possible. So probably because I was growing increasingly snotty and sarcastic towards the battalion staff, I always seemed to be the officer assigned to lead their patrols and raids, often at night. The battalion staff chose me now to go back to our just vacated battlefield to lead a night patrol of 25 men in an assault on the town of Mulhausen, which is on the river Moder. Why we were attacking this town, nobody seemed to know. It was probably to keep the battalion staff busy so they could mark something on their maps. I was issued a very light pistol containing a colored flare with which to call down artillery fire on the town if needed. With my experience of botched night operations, I could have told what was going to happen. We tried to enter the town by the most obvious route insisted upon by the battalion staff. Machine guns at the edge of town stopped us immediately, of course, and I decided to fire the planned signal flare to call down artillery on these machine guns. But the very light pistol, of course, didn't work, no matter how often and how violently I pounded on its firing pin. Finally, we retreated in disorder, carrying one man with a bullet wound in his thigh. It was while retreating this night up the silent, snowy slopes of these hills that I saw a wonderfully absurd, bizarre, and unforgettable sight, which I remembered to this day. There was some moonlight that night, perhaps one of the reasons our raid so conspicuously failed. Climbing slowly up the hill, draped with a long belt of machine gun ammunition like a German soldier in a cheap patriotic illustration, I came upon a perfectly preserved dead waxwork German squad. It was very cold by this time, and dead bodies didn't smell at all. They stayed there absolutely pristine for 2 or 3 months. It was so cold. By this time, the whole front was silent. There was no rifle or machine gun firing, no artillery, no mortars, not even clanking tank treads or truck motors to be heard in the distance. The spectacle that caused my mouth to open in wonder and almost in admiration consisted of 5 German soldiers spread out prone in a semicircular skirmish line. They were still staring forward, alert for signs of the Amis. That's what they called us, the Americans, Amis. Behind them, in the center of the semicircle, was an equally rigid German medic with his Red Cross armband who had been crawling forward to do his work. In his left hand, he held a roll of 2-inch bandage. In his right hand, a pair of surgical scissors. I could infer from this a plausible narrative. One or more men in the group had been wounded, and as the medic crawled forward to do his duty, his intention was rudely frustrated by an unspeakably loud, sharp crack overhead. And instantly, the lights went out for all of them. The episode was doubtless a tribute to our proximity artillery fuse, an invaluable invention which arrived on the line that winter, enabling a shell, an artillery shell, to explode not when it struck something, as usual, but when it came near to striking something. Here it must have gone off 5 or 10 yards above its victims. Or perhaps the damage had been done by the kind of artillery stunt called time on target, a showy mathematical technique of firing many guns at once from various places, so that regardless of their varying distance from the target, the shells arrive all at the same time. The surprise is devastating, and the destruction immediate and unimaginable. Whichever, the little waxwork squad, its soldiers unbloody and unmarked, had all left life at the same instant. For a minute, as you can imagine, I stood and contemplated this weird tableau. It was a sight that somehow brought art and life into strange relation. If an artist had arranged these figures this way, with the compelling narrative element, an audience could hardly have refrained from praise. It was so cold that the bodies didn't smell, and they'd not begun visibly to decompose, but their open eyes were clouded, and snow had lodged in their ears and in the openings in their clothes and the slits in their caps. Their flesh was whitish green. Although they were prone, their knees and elbows were bent as if they were athletes terribly surprised while sprinting. They looked like plaster simulacra excavated from some chill white Herculaneum. But no one but me apparently saw this sight in the moonlight. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? Or was it some kind of show put on for my benefit? Was I intended somehow to interpret this as an image of the whole war and its meaning? Less a struggle between good and evil than a worldwide disaster implicating everyone alike, scarcely distinguishing its victims in the general shambles and ruin. Whatever this experience remained with me as a prime illustration of modernism. Not that it occurred, but that it seemed so normal and that no one seemed to care. At this moment, my upbringing in Pasadena, California seemed very far away indeed. After the war, I finished my 1 year at Pomona College and got into Harvard to pursue the graduate program in English literature. For a literary boy from the West, I almost said the prairies, Entering Harvard Yard for the first time was a thrill like my first Strother-like glimpse of Paris. Because my ideas of antiquity were still highly Californian, the 18th century brick buildings of the silent yard set off by old elms made a powerful impression on me. At this point, the GI Bill, of course, was sending all types to graduate school, and not all were committed to the most rigorous of humanistic procedures. One fellow I know was expelled for lying to a professor about a late paper he had cleverly thrown over the top of the professor's locked but roofless library carrel, and the paper landed on or near a pile of non-belated and not yet graded papers. Alas, it landed on the floor some distance away, and interrogated, the student tried to argue that it had been on top of the original stack all the time. But earlier, the professor, this is very Harvard, the professor had counted the bona fide papers, and the miscreant was told to vacate Harvard within 24 hours, which was a standard penalty when I went to the graduate school. Draconic punishment of this sort with no appeal was a Harvard tradition, and this takes you way back to the 1940s. This would be unthinkable today. Final examinations were given in large rooms to several different classes at the same time, and eagle-eyed proctors, avid to catch wrongdoers, gumshoed up and down constantly. Once I witnessed a proctor rush to one undergraduate, seize his blue book, and ceremoniously tear it in half before his eyes. The student understood instantly that he'd been seen cheating, that he'd been accused and tried and convicted right there, and that he was lost. That's an example of the privileges and the disciplinary style assumed by the higher learning before the 1960s. Now today, that young person would be invited to plead his case before a student faculty administration committee, and there would be a good chance that the college, not the student, would be found at fault. This is more stuff about my days at Harvard. Let me read this. It's hard in the days of television, and when film is taken seriously as an intellectual subject, it's hard to recall the days when literature mattered much more than it does now. Not just literature, but verbal culture in general, spoken language as well as printed. These were days and nights of a literary intensity that could never come again. For verbal culture in those pre-electronic years was still taken for granted as a permanent and invaluable thing. To excel in it then gave one a kind of status unthinkable now. The whole PhD program in English, producing endless English professors, seemed based on the plausible assumption that there would always be significant demand for explicators of Shakespeare and Milton, Samuel Johnson and Keats and Melville and Faulkner. It's hard to remember that TV was not on the scene yet, nor had anyone suggested that film might be material for serious study. So we were all very bookish. Once I went on to my first teaching job at Connecticut College, my presiding emotion from then on, from the 1950s on, was annoyance, often intensifying to virtually disabling anger. Not at the young women I taught, they were perfectly innocent. It was at the government. It was at the development of this immense hoax of the Cold War and the necessary euphemism designed to make it acceptable. Anger at my accepting invitations to make too many changes of identity too fast, from college boy to professional killer, and then to benign professor. I was angry at myself for my inability to make sense of this process, to infer from it some general enlightenment instead of cynicism and nihilism. I was angry at the whole post-war atmosphere of public misrepresentation and fatuous optimism, the widespread feeling that I sensed that the war had produced good for the United States, with good defined as people's ability to buy new cars and refrigerators. So what if 85 million people had been killed, most of them civilians? Here in the USA, no one had been bombed, eviscerated, burnt to death, raped, or torn apart. Here, the war was now largely represented almost as a source of fun. And you've seen this phrase, the good war, become increasingly popular since, almost as a source of fun for which act national euphemism became necessary. The War Department was euphemized into the Department of Defense, as if we feared attacks from Mexico. The armaments and war budget became the defense budget. And soon airstrikes, later surgical airstrikes, would replace the bombing of women and children. Public rhetoric was growing indistinguishable from commercial advertising. And I came to regard both as a cynical manipulation of the weak of mind by the cunning and the avaricious. Increasingly, the country seemed managed not by an elected government, but by the National Association of Manufacturers, abetted by the CIA, forcing anyone of energetic conscience to embrace the role of enemy. And how could I avoid an indignation at the local bragging habit? America's proud pointing to its 3,000 colleges and universities without for a minute noticing their failure to produce more than a handful of first-rate minds. I was bitterly conscious that the central thinkers of the modern world, people like Freud, Marx, Darwin, and Jung, had all arisen elsewhere. At one point, I taught for a year at the University of Heidelberg, and that was a very interesting experience, as you can imagine, for an ex-soldier who had spent the latter part of his youth trying to kill people like those people. Well, this year in Germany, with travel during the long vacations to Sicily and Spain, inaugurated for me a serious European period which has never come to a close. I can trace back to 1957 my lifetime fondness for European reality, involving careful attention to wine and food, productive cynicism, instead of destructive, productive cynicism, sexual freedom, sun and water, the fun of languages, and enthusiasm for beneficent socialism, as in bike paths, the absence of private universities, like the University of Pennsylvania, tied to the views of private money, and more so, the enthusiastic state support of theater and music. My half-European orientation is hard to slough off. Finishing a New York Times crossword the other day, I was confronted with a clue, Georgian capital, in 7 letters. Of course, I wrote Tbilisi, T-B-I-L-I-S-I, but soon saw that it didn't fit and that the right answer was merely Atlanta. How did I react to the assassination of John F. Kennedy? Very badly, I'm afraid. For me, the assassination augmented my sense that there was something radically wrong with this country. Its emphasis on mere freedom gone wildly awry to embrace owning lots of guns and discharging them at will when angry. I had had enough of guns, as you can imagine. William Carlos Williams has noticed in a poem called To Elsie that, as he says, the pure products of America go crazy. It was not just Lee Harvey Oswald with his paranoia and self-righteousness and monomania who seemed so pure a product of America. It was his pathetic mother as well, convinced that by his murderous action, Lee had achieved what every good American lusts for, celebrity, and had become thus a world historical figure, as she called him. And one should add the bizarre Jack Ruby, anxious to become a heroic object of national admiration for killing the killer. It was beginning to look as if the practice of insensate violence was becoming a firm element of American national uniqueness. It was beginning to look as if a pronounced leaning toward the psychopathic would have to be included in any future list of national characteristics. There was still a lingering bit of my innocence to be destroyed, namely the belief that widespread experience of literature and the ideas enacted by it would serve as an antidote to the fatuous and menacing collection of American folk attitudes and behaviors, perhaps appropriate once to the frontier, but well out of date now. If the John F. Kennedy murder did not wholly destroy that optimistic belief, it suffered all but terminal damage years later, when first Martin Luther King was killed, and then 2 months later, Robert Kennedy. What were we witnessing? Was it true that now the bottom dogs were wreaking their revenge against distinction, whether black or white, and that therefore a similarity could be discerned between these assaults on exceptional people and such apparently remote phenomena as the Cultural Revolution in China, the actions of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and, to stretch the point just a bit, the annoyance of American students at being confronted with ideas and even literary and cultural forms identifiable with elitism or marked by a notable elevation above the styles and capacities of the folk. It was as if distinction itself was now become a stigma. I think I'll end pretty soon, but there are a couple of passages further I want to give you. In my book called Wartime, subtitled Understanding and Behavior in the Second World War, I continued campaigning against the ignorant notion that the war wasn't really so bad. It's a notion held largely by people who made money out of it, but not by any of the troops who actually had to fight it. My adversaries now became all those who would see nothing significant in the elimination of the ironic quotation marks around Studs Terkel's title, The Good War. And I would predict that in 20 years, those quotation marks are simply going to vanish because irony becomes more and more difficult to promulgate in this country. In some letters and diaries from the war edited by the British editor Ronald Blythe, we find a London air raid warden describing a little boy fetched out of a fire who kept saying, my little whittle, as he searched for it with his hands, but it had been burnt off. Blythe ends his anthology with a famous letter of farewell written by a flight officer of the RAF to his mother. This flight officer says, for all that can be said against it, I still maintain that this war is a very good thing. Every individual is having his chance to give and dare all for his principle, like the martyrs of old. My comment on that at the end of the paragraph was this: tell that to the boy who lost his whittle. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to read. Any wounded veteran will assure you that for him the war has never ended. It's impossible for me to affect forgetfulness when each month the government check awarded for my 40% disability arrives, and when each winter the wet cold awakens pain in my leg wound. And it started already, by the way. I still think of the faculty men's room at the universities I teach in as the officer's latrine, and I frequently call it that. I still let angry, disgusted Army rhetoric burst forth as when I refer to a dim colleague up for promotion to associate professor as, quote, that dumb fuck, or silently urge some slowpoke in line to move your ass. I still have Army dreams, although now they're likely to be more technical than frightening. I waste time devising wild schemes of revenge against the Germans, like even today resettling them all in Madagascar, something they wanted to do to the Jews, and making over the former Germany to the Jews to be renamed Israel North. All this serves to flesh out Martha Gellhorn's observation about those of us who grew up in the 1940s. She writes very accurately and sensitively, War was our condition and our history, the place we had to live in. And the end of the war was not the end of the disaster, as the poet Howard Nemeroff understands in the poem called Redeployment. They say the war is over, but water still comes bloody from the taps. And my pet cat, in his disorder, vomits worms which crawl swiftly away. Maybe they leave the house. These worms are white and flecked with the cat's blood. The war may be over. I know a man who keeps a pleasant souvenir. He keeps a soldier's dead blue eyeballs that he found somewhere, hard as chalk and blue as slate. He clicks them in his pocket while he talks. And it's not just ex-soldiers for whom the war will never be over. In the late 1940s, while I was a graduate student in Cambridge, I was having lunch alone in a Cambridge restaurant. A middle-aged woman was watching me so closely that I felt uncomfortable. I wondered, did I know her? Had we met somewhere? Suddenly, without warning, she burst into uncontrollable tears. Did I remind her of her dead son? Had she been angry for a long time, too? And that's the end of the book. I don't know how we're going to work out this book signing. I'll be happy to sign any books and to talk to anybody. But before we do that, let me solicit your questions and your comments and remind you that if you have a question or comment to make, that I would like you to come up and talk into the microphone so everybody can hear. If you will. Okay, that's good. So anybody who wants to say something, put up a hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Is everyone so stunned that they have nothing to say? Yes?
You spoke of your naivete, age 19, 20, entering. How could anyone be a conscientious objector, say, at that time, when this war fever was developing? Did you see any of this around?
No, but I had friends who were COs. You know, it took character, which they had. It took character and courage. But it was by no means difficult. You simply declared to your draft board that you were conscientious objector. You went before a board. And in those days, they rather insisted on some kind of religious basis for this that could be evidenced with documents or with your past behavior. But it wasn't by any means impossible, and a great many people did it. Not a great many, but several 100,000. And those people, just to inform everybody else, worked in hospitals, they worked in non-combatant work, they never wore uniforms, and they performed valuable service. What else have we? Yes, in the back. Somebody way in the rear. Can you carry that thing back there?
You're in the ceiling.
Would you come forward then and speak into this thing?
Stand up and speak.
Okay.
We know that American prisoners were executed by a German panzer outfit in Malmedy
Yes.
during the Battle of the Bulge. Do you know of any instances where American Army units did likewise to capture Germans?
I know of many such incidents, but the numbers of German troops killed were smaller than that. It is very difficult in the hysteria of close infantry warfare. It is very difficult to bridle your natural impulses towards revenge, outrage, fear, hatred, and so forth. And actually, one of the junior officers' duties is to keep people calm after an attack. Say, don't do that, put that bayonet away, don't shoot that man, and so on. There's a lot of that. And sometimes the officer is successful in stopping it. It never happened with my people. But my people now and then would shoot at the German medics out of anger, and one had to shout at them to stop it and point out that if we shoot their medics, they will shoot ours, and so forth. I know of a few incidents where 2 or 3 or maybe up to 4 or 5 captured Germans were shot by our people before they had to go to the rear. But I never heard of a thing as big as the Malmedy massacre. that involves 100 or so people. The point is, war is not rational. It's a brutal, bloody, hysterical business. And when your own life is at stake or you feel yourself threatened, you will strike out, regardless of the so-called rules of land warfare, and you will do what seems appropriate. It's too bad, but the only way to solve it is to stay out of wars. What else have we? Yes, sir.
Fragging was a term that came to the fore in Vietnam. Was there anything that happened like that in World War II that wouldn't
Fragging.
be talked about? Fragging.
No, interesting question. He's talking about the habit, or at least the rumor of the habit in Vietnam, of enlisted men angry at their junior officers throwing grenades into their tents or something, hitting them with fragments. It's called fragging, killing the officers. I never heard of that happening at all in the Second War, and it wouldn't have happened in the Second War because nobody thought the war was unfair. Nobody thought that they had been victimized while some other people, like college students, as in Vietnam, got off free. Everybody was, if not happy, at least willing to fight for the proclaimed ends. I'm glad we didn't have that problem. We might have lost the war if we had. But it would have been unthinkable. What else? Yes.
Yes, I served in the Army in Vietnam as a medic with an infantry platoon, and I wondered how you came to deal with the issue of grief and grieving for your dead comrades and grieving for the innocent civilians that you mentioned that died. I wondered how you personally, over the years or with time, how you handle that issue.
Okay. At the moment, those things happen. And when I had those feelings, you did nothing because I couldn't break down in public. It would have ruined my act. I couldn't have led troops after that. My object was to lead these 40 young men satisfactorily. But ever since, almost everything I've written resonates with suppressed grief. I think an acute reader can infer that from my works. There's nothing to be done about it. I've never gone to a psychiatrist about it. I've never had any treatment for it. As far as I know, nobody I know who fought in the Second World War has been troubled by extraordinary psychiatric or psychological symptoms. We're all a little jumpy, some things you never get over. When I hear an air hammer in the street, I throw myself on the ground. It's a machine gun to me. Or when I hear a very, very loud noise in the street, I imagine that it's an artillery shell, and I look for shelter. One never gets over that sort of thing. Another thing I do is when I'm riding in a train or in a car, I'm constantly looking at the landscape, locating positions for machine guns, or minefields, or anti-tank weapons. You never get over that because that's one of your constant obligations. You be alert to future positions, which you may need in the next few minutes, for all you know. The Vietnam War, as far as I understand the psychology of the poor people who had to fight it, involved very special feelings of guilt at killing civilians, very specific feelings that one had been unfairly singled out for torment. These feelings didn't occur in the Second War, at least not in the units I was with. Let me observe also about the soldiers I dealt with. They were wonderful people, but they were people I'd never met before. I would never have met if it hadn't been for the war. They were working class people. They were the people who worked in our mines, on the railways, things like that. They weren't university students and never would be. They weren't readers of books and never would be. They were good, solid, working class youths. And what happened during the war, I have a paragraph about it in here, was a sort of unwitting holocaust of the American male working class. What happened in the war is that these boys were killed in their tens of thousands. And it certainly changed the genetic character of American fatherhood for a generation or two. Nobody's noticed this. But I think it's something people should notice, especially when they think about going to war again. What else have we? Yes?
World War I, at least in Europe and in France, France, there was a large movement of pacifism on the part of people who had fought in the trenches in World War I as a result of their experiences. Can you speculate about why there wasn't a corresponding movement among veterans of World War II?
That's a very interesting question. You're quite right. There was no pacifist movement in reaction to the facts of the Second World War. I don't know the reason. I suppose it is because of the viciousness of German behavior discovered at the end of the war, and that is the Holocaust and all that. I think that persuaded people even more fully than anything else had up to that time of the justness of the war. It was necessary, it was awful, but its effect was beneficial. It wiped out Nazism. The war in Japan, including the atom bomb, wiped out the Japanese empire. And those were very good ends for the war. When I hear the expression, the good war, I'm quite willing to accept it politically. Not, of course, experientially or psychologically, but politically. It was a good war. It got rid of a lot of undeniable wickedness. And it forced two countries to start all over again as much as possible, Japan and Germany. And most people forget that Germany as it exists now, excuse me, that Germany as it exists now is entirely a creation of the United States. And its beneficent socialism, especially its support of the arts, theater, and music, is what we could have here if we could start over again, which we cannot. But it's a very instructive thing that when Americans are told to start a new country, which they did in Germany, they start one which is not at all like this one. Although this is a particularly fine country, you know, it's all right. What else do we have? Yeah.
In your essay, Thank God for the Atom Bomb, you defended the Truman's use of the atomic weapons. Have you had any second thoughts on that? And what do you think of revisionist historians who increasingly, it seems, try to make that out to have been a wrong decision?
Yeah, well, I disagree with them. But one thing you have to remember is that when we dropped that bomb, nobody had any idea of the future. Nobody knew anything about the threat the atom bomb was going to pose in successive decades. We thought that was it. We were certain that nobody except the Americans was clever enough to find the formula to build one like that. And we possessed it. I've said thank God for the atom bomb publicly many times because it saved my life. The unit I was with at that point was scheduled to invade the southern shore of the island of Kyushu, which is the southern island of the large Japanese group. And I know I would have been killed at that because I was starting to lose my hand at governing infantry troops. I wasn't interested anymore. I'd almost decided that I would be killed, and if you decide that, you will be. And so it saved my life, and it saved the life of millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians, as well as American and Allied soldiers. Most people don't know that the Japanese were planning to execute all of their prisoners of war the minute we invaded those islands. And that included Dutch and British, Australian, New Zealand, American, and so on. Helpless people. Therefore, thank God for the atom bomb. The shock of it was sufficient to end the war, and that is what I celebrated in that writing. Although I recognize, the other position. You have to believe people are more clever than they are. If you imagine that that bomb was dropped to scare the Russians 10 years in the future. People don't work that way. They, especially in war, they're motivated by immediate challenges. Solve them by immediate decisions. People who fight in a war believe that there is no future. They act as if there were no future. The object is entirely to succeed in the present, that is, to win the war and therefore stop it. Some people, while I'm on the topic, a lot of people quite justly point out that we could have saved many lives if we had bombed the railway tracks leading to Auschwitz. That's undeniably true. But the wartime world that I came from, that everybody else came from, valued only those techniques that would win the war. So we asked of everything that anybody proposed, will it win the war? That wouldn't have won the war, wouldn't have helped to win the war, it would have prolonged it. It's a sad thing to have to say, but it's true. And that's the nature of immense world wars. What else have we? Yes, please.
I spoke to you this morning on the Chris Lydon show.
Oh, yes.
And I mentioned the sadness, the tragedy of young men on either side, good, decent men, say German and American, killing one another. And they might have been clergymen, doctors, lawyers, marvelous contributors to society. And therefore, the terrible tragedy of war. And I mentioned what Pope Benedict V said after the war, that he had come to the personal conclusion that drafting men to fight in war was immoral, that the state had no right to make men die. I'm sure you've heard of Dr. Keegan, a gentleman who has written so very well on war. He seems to feel that war is an inevitable thing, like contumescence and detumescence. It wanes and then it comes together again. Do you have any comments on that?
I'd like not to believe in that, but sometimes I find myself slightly visited by that formulation, that war is a perpetual fixture in human affairs. Maybe it's not true. I hope it's not true. I agree with Pope Benedict entirely. And I want to say that the Germans that I killed in the war and that I directed my platoon to kill were utterly guiltless. They were not Nazis at all. These were pathetic farm boys who had been conscripted in Bavaria and the agricultural provinces of Germany. They'd been slapped into uniforms. They'd been taught barely how to fire a rifle, and they were propelled towards us, and we killed them by the dozens. The whole thing is ridiculous as well as wicked. But what do you do? How do you prevent it? How do you stop it? I don't know. When the United Nations was first considered, I still had enough naivete about me to believe that it might be the solution, that it might develop a great international peacekeeping force made of soldiers from all countries who would have all to speak the same language, of course, probably English or maybe French, and that they would run around the globe preventing the breakout of wars. That hasn't happened, alas. But I think the ultimate solution to the problem will be something like that. But you bring up a very interesting point. Yes?
You spoke on Chris Lydon's show this morning about your father's memories of the First War. And when you speak now, you say your own tremendous surprise as a boy of 20 of the horrors that you encountered. Didn't your father give you some sense of what you were going in for?
You know, I'm afraid I didn't understand that. Can you get that louder?
This is not amplified.
That does it? Would you come up and do it in the microphone? I sense that you have something very interesting to say, and I'd like to hear it and respond to it. And by the way, it's getting on, so let's have this the last question, please.
Thank you. I enjoyed hearing Chris Lydon's show this morning, but you spoke then of hearing your father describe what had happened in the First War.
Yes.
And what surprised me just now was your surprise as a boy of 20 at what you've encountered when you came. Had your father not been able to convey to you anything of what it was? I know my father did.
It's a very, very good question. The answer is no, because my father never fought in that war. He was in it, like many veterans today who go to reunions and so on and put on those little overseas caps. He never fought the war. He was in the ordnance department. What he did was to develop long lists of the characteristics of artillery shells. But he never got near the front line. He never killed anybody. He was never shot at. So when I talked to him about the war, it was largely about, such standard topics of buffoonery as riding in French railway cars, 48s, and French food and flirting with the mademoiselle and things like that. But he knew nothing about that war, as a matter of fact, nothing more than the ordinary newspaper reader would have read. Okay, we'll close up now, and thank you very much for coming.